Previously on Brokers, Bagmen, and Moles.
You look up from the center of the floor, and it was virtually an impossible task. There were all sorts of kind of unsavory people. Maury Kravitz, Melamed. Maybe they're there doing something beyond just trading and taking advantage of the abuses. Two of them were segregated, Pace and Sam Cali. They were the ABS brokers.
Hey, how are you?
Good. Long time no talk.
Yeah, I know. It really has been. The document's incredible, by the way. But how are you? How are things going?
I'm
This
good.
is a phone call I had with our producer, Danielle. And the incredible document she's referring to is something I stumbled upon as we were getting ready to wrap up this podcast.
That was fucking crazy, right? Like, I wasn't sure. It was nuts too, because I was literally.
How did you not?
Well, it was just in all those fucking documents, and like I never read all of them. Like I didn't read all of them, and it was literally like one of the last things I didn't read, and I was just sitting there, I was like, holy shit! Like this is, it's like
It's all of it.
The document in question is a memorandum filed by former Assistant U.S. Attorney Tom Durkin. We'll call this the Durkin document. Durkin is a former Assistant U.S. Attorney turned defense lawyer, and in this case, he was defending a broker named Sam Cali. You'll remember Cali from the end of our last episode. He's one of two brokers who was severed from the main Japanese yen trial, along with Ray Pace.
Like it's the fucking case that Durkin made against the Merc, but it's just nuts to me, like the detail of how they were going to expose Leo and like multiple other exchange officials that were like, like the one guy was like, yeah, you can steal a little bit, but not too much. Steal one tick on each order, not four.
Yeah, that quote was like, we'd have to read that in the episode. Like those moments.
Totally.
Yeah.
We have to at least try to talk to Tom Durkin, right? I mean, he's the lawyer. Like, what? Hey, we have to be like, yo, what happened?
I'm Anjay Nagpal, and this is the season finale of Brokers, Bagmen, and Moles.
It was a result of my opening statement that they all started screaming bloody murder.
So the guy with the biggest pile of money has the most control, and indeed took advantage of it.
Give me a break. Sam Cali's doing this with the president of the exchange, and he's supposed to think he's committing a federal crime? Are you crazy? They didn't risk putting guys in the pit for this kind of nickel-dime shit.
Let's go back to 2020. The world was shutting down, but I decided to start this podcast. Prominent Chicago attorney Tom Durkin is one of the first people I contacted. I emailed and called and never heard back. Over the next 2 years, I became convinced that the government went after a bunch of unlucky traders who did business as business was done. I thought it was unfair that nobody pointed a finger at the exchanges or the people that ran them. And then, with the discovery of Tom Durkin's custom and practice document among 100,000 pages of trial transcripts and government filings, I realized that somebody did. So I emailed Durkin again, and this time I included a copy of his memo. He responded almost immediately and agreed to an interview. His office was in the famous Rookery building on LaSalle Street, the same LaSalle Street as the storied Chicago Board of Trade. We interviewed Durkin in the historic Burnham Library, which used to overlook the site of the infamous 1893 World's Fair. In fact, Daniel Burnham sat in this very room and looked out over the landscape as he was planning the event. But we were here to talk about another infamous event in Chicago history.
I'm Tom Durkin. I'm a Chicago lawyer. I've been a lawyer here for 48 years. practiced primarily federal criminal defense. I was an assistant U.S. attorney for 6 years from 1978 to 1984.
An assistant U.S. attorney until 1984, meaning he left that post just before the FBI arrived in the trading pits of Chicago.
I've been involved in a fair amount of high-profile cases. I've done a fair amount of white-collar defense. This was a big one. I mean, you cannot understand how big a deal this was at the time it happened. Everyone thought that the whole murk was going to come crumbling down. And they thought at the time that these cases that got brought were only the tip of the iceberg, and there were going to be some very big cases to follow. And virtually every lawyer in town worth their salt was involved in these cases as a result.
Durkin included. He agreed to defend a yen broker named Sam Cali.
The case came in, but I remember at first realizing that it was going to take an enormous amount of work just to understand what the charges, what they were talking about. So as a result, having had some experience of being on the floor, I asked if I could get a coat and a badge and could just go to the floor and listen. I think it might have been Jack Sandner who arranged that for me.
As a reminder, Jack Sandner was the number 2 at the Merc for many years before becoming a chairman for a very long run in the 80s and 90s.
I got to know Jack very well through this case. And another very well-known trader named Jimmy Colentus.
Jimmy Colentus was a co-founder of ABS Partners Brokerage, and on the floor, he was known for his tough guy reputation.
Sam Cali worked for Jimmy Colentus. Jimmy was a big help. Jimmy's quite a guy. He's an amazing guy. He was able to educate me quite a bit. But what I learned the most from was literally going to the floor every morning.
Durkin spent a lot of time on the floor over the course of a couple of months, and with Jack and Jimmy showing him the ropes, he began to see what all the traders were saying.
Quickest things I learned is that this curb trading wasn't nefarious. It was to really help each other out and to help clear people's decks so that they didn't get hung out to dry, which I thought there's always a customer underneath every one of these orders. And if somebody could get stuck on it, the customer got stuck. So I began to doubt the description outlined in the indictment of how the game was supposed to be played. Seemed very different to me than from the way it did play and the way it had to play. And it also seemed to me that there was a lot of what they called standard operating procedure on the floor, that's what you learn.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think it's like one of the lawyers actually had a great way to describe it. He said, people made minor unintended violations on one side of a big gray area, and some people made egregious theft with malintent on the other. The gray area is policed by the exchange. Customers can complain, no customers complained. The exchange let this big gray area exist despite technology existing to make the area smaller.
I think that's accurate.
Yeah.
To turn these into federal crimes, you have to prove what they call specific intent, that you had the intent to defraud. And I'm not saying there was never fraud, don't misunderstand me. Of course there was. But a lot of what they were calling fraud, I didn't see as fraud. And it offended me that some of the big shots at the exchange should have been included in that, and they weren't. And Sam Cali was a working man. Sam's a wonderful guy, by the way.
Sam, Ray Pace, T-Bun, they're all working guys.
Blue-collar, working-class guy, and he wasn't making a ton of money. He made good money, but he was just a broker. He wasn't a local. The locals were the ones that made the most money, from what I recall. They also took the bigger risk. But, Sam was just there filling orders for the Colentus company. I can't remember the name of it, but
it was ABS Partners.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That was a very legitimate company.
ABS Partners may have been a legitimate business, but the big brokerage firm was led by partners with sketchy pasts like Jimmy Colentus and Maury Kravitz. The more time Durkin spent on the floor, the clearer he saw the case. So when the government announced the indictments, and Sam and Ray were both being charged with RICO violations,
I thought RICO was ridiculous. I understand why the government uses it, because it's heavy-handed and it can produce cooperation. To call the mercantile exchange a racketeering enterprise, I thought was a bit over the top. I mean, that's just as ridiculous.
what was your defense and how was it different than the defense of the other traders?
Well, my defense, and I didn't win a lot of friends on this, was that many of the things the government said happened. And most people were defending on the basis that the government wasn't going to be able to prove that any of this happened, and I didn't think that was very realistic. It looked to me like they were going to be able to prove it.
Durkin applied a legal term to the rule breaking that was so prevalent on the floor.
It seemed to me that a better defense was that nobody was intending to defraud on this, and it was custom and practice, and that became very controversial, and a lot of the lawyers took issue with that because they wanted me to go along with the regular defense that this just didn't occur, and they were going to be able to prove that. I didn't think that was right.
When Tom Durkin thinks something isn't right, he lets it be known.
I didn't want to have to go to trial with people who were claiming this didn't happen. I was giving them notice that we were going to claim that a lot of these things did happen, but it wasn't a crime.
I thought that line of defense was pretty bold, and maybe even risky. It took about 2 years for the government to start Sam and Ray's trial, so Durkin had plenty of time to craft his argument. You subpoenaed the Merck and Belcher and those places. Like, you talk about that process. Do you remember what you were going after, what you were trying to find?
We were just looking for instances where Merck rule violations were done repeatedly and not with an intent to defraud. It certainly became very clear to me that if Sam Cali was a crook, so was Leo Melamed, and I didn't think Leo Melamed was a crook. It just didn't seem right to me that there were some things that just clearly went on, that nobody thought was a crime.
The idea that rule breaking was custom and practice was the core of Durkin's defense, and he explains it all so well in this petition. Since he hadn't seen this defense in a long, long time, I pulled out a copy of what we've been calling the Durkin document. Would you do me a huge favor and then just read this paragraph here, and then tell us about it?
I was talking about a guy by the name of March who would testify. I believe we had a FBI report to this effect. And it reads, what we said was Mr. March will also testify to his relationship with fellow trader David Horberg, a yen broker who filled orders at certain times for Delshire Investments Company. Delshire is a clearing member / brokerage firm in which Leo J. Melamed is a controlling principal. Mr. Melamed is a living legend at the CMA and universally acclaimed as being the visionary most responsible for the creation and success of the financial instrument futures contracts and the resulting spectacular growth of the CME. March will testify to being required to change a price on a trade with Horberg because Horberg advised him this is for Leo. March will testify that Horberg repaid him, March, for this price change on the Melamed order by delivering points on subsequent orders. And, those things happened.
The Durkin document laid out that those things happened a lot.
This is such an amazingly put together document. And when I first discovered it, honestly, my jaw was on the floor because you laid out, okay, there's Eric March who's going to testify that in his 22 interviews with the FBI, he names 108 other traders in addition to the already indicted defendants that have engaged in similar practices. Number two, Thomas Braniff is going to testify that in his 26 interviews with the FBI, 55 other traders in addition to the 19 that were indicted as having engaged in trading practices similar to those charged in the indictment. It goes on and it just paints the picture, as you say, that everyone is doing it, and you have specific instances of other members of the Board of Governors, engaging in these same practices.
It goes in part to my theory that what was really wrong with the government's theory of its case is that it didn't include any of the higher-ups, and it had to include the higher-ups if what they were saying was true. And why should Sam Cali suffer if Leo Melamed's not suffering?
To support his theory, Durkin gathered a mountain of evidence against the higher-ups. Have a listen.
March will testify to a conversation during the hearing with a member of the Board of Governors and then chairman of the Floor Practices Committee, William C. Muno. March claims Muno told him that, quote, it was all right to give away 1 point per contract on the close. However, 4 points per contract was too blatant. March will go on to testify, to a variety of transactions in which he engaged with members of the hierarchy of the CME. For example, Sleds will describe a 200 contract transaction between co-defendant Baker and a fellow yen trader, Ira Harris, a member of the Board of Governors of the CME. Sleds will testify that after the closing bell in the yen pit, when defendant Cali would recite trades to fellow trader Stephen E. Wallach, vice chairman of the CME Board of Governors and chairman of the Floor Practices Committee. Sleds will testify that the orders he saw Cali did not want the business because if he, Baker, did not get a fill that was satisfactory to Melamed, he, Melamed, would come back and demand a fill at a particular price. Volk will testify that he understood Baker to be stating even if a broker gave Melamed a fill that Melamed knew was an honest fill, but it was not to his satisfaction, Melamed would simply not accept the order. He will also corroborate the Sleds, March, and Baker evidence concerning Mr. Melamed's trading practices. Cali will testify that the observation of and open participation in such practices with members of the exchange hierarchy also led him to believe he was conforming his conduct to the requirements of the law.
This echoes exactly what traders have told us in previous episodes. Here's Ray Pace.
That didn't sit right with me. Yeah. Like Leo would point the finger at, like, these are the bad apples, because them guys, if they were in the pit, were conducting business the exact same way. They said they weren't, they're lying,
T-Bun said the same thing.
I had nothing to tell them that wasn't going on at the beginning of time down there.
And even Dietrich Volk, the FBI agent in the Japanese yen pit, said the same thing.
I think there was about 40 guys in the yen pit at the open every morning. We indicted 21 of them. And if I would have stood on the other side of the pit, we would have indicted the people over there. And if I would have gone to the cattle futures or, anywhere, given enough time to acclimate, would have been in the same position.
They're all agreeing. Everyone did this on the floor. But there's one point that Tom Durkin wanted to make very clear.
I wasn't trying to lay out Leo Melamed as a crook. He was no more of a crook, in my opinion, than Sam Cali. I don't think these were crimes that they were committing.
Whether they were or were not crimes is way above my pay grade. But what I do know is that Leo Melamed and the rest of the Board of Governors should have been treated the exact same way as Ray Pace, T-Bun, and the other traitors that were indicted. Either they were all guilty of committing crimes, or none of them were.
I think that pleading pretty much sets forth the whole controversy. It's actually pretty good. I hadn't remembered that.
Yeah. No, it's excellent. I mean, so,
But you'll notice that my wife signed her initials to my signature, which probably means she did most of it. So I have to give her credit.
Absolutely. It's amazing work.
It's pretty good pleading.
Durkin's wife is a fellow lawyer. They run their practice together to this very day. If you're following along still, you're probably asking yourself, if this perfect defense existed, what happened? Before we continue, I want you to listen to an interesting story from FBI agent Dietrich Volk about visiting Sam Cali way back in January of 1989 when the investigation was first leaked by the Chicago Tribune.
I got him to come up to an apartment, and he gave us a statement, and then he later decided he didn't want to cooperate. And being that he was a broker for ABS, I guess I can kind of understand that, some of the rumors I'd heard.
Can you expand on that? What were the rumors that you heard, and how would that influence what Sam would do?
Well, ABS was a brokerage group that there were some notorious characters. They're in books. Maury Kravitz, Leo Melamed, the Borsalinos. There was rumors of organized crime involvement in ABS, and I think Sam was aware of those rumors.
And why do you think Sam Cali chose to go to prison instead of cooperating?
I don't know exactly why Sam Cali would make that decision. All those men had families to support after this was all over, and then there were the nuances of the organized crime influence that might possibly exist there, which I doubt were lost on any of them. We just didn't wield as big a club as the Exchange did in terms of their efforts to discourage cooperation.
David Griesing and Lori Morse, authors of Brokers, Bagmen, and Moles, reported that Dean Colentus, brother of ABS head Jimmy Colentus, called Sam Cali and told him not to cooperate with the government. So, in this case, it was ABS, not the Exchange, that wielded the big club, and Sam would go to trial. But before the main yen trial got underway, Tom Durkin notified the judge of his bold defense strategy and requested that his client be severed from the main trial because his defense clashes so radically with that of the other defendants.
It caused a big problem at the trial because Judge Hart didn't grant the severance. He did sever us after my opening statement, which created quite a controversy. I felt bad because I guess people didn't think I really would do it.
He felt bad because after not getting severed before the opening arguments, Durkin showed up to the main trial and started using a defense strategy that basically calls 19 of the other defendants in the room guilty.
It was a result of my opening statement that they all started screaming bloody murder, and I just looked at Judge Hart and said, what do you want me to do? I told you this is going to happen. And, Judge Hart was hitting himself in the head, like, oh my God. So we got severed.
As we know from episode 9, the traitors in that main yen pit went free. There was not a single guilty verdict on over 240 charges. After that, Durkin's request to sever from the main trial became even riskier.
It didn't make me very popular because, Melamed and the higher-ups were never included, and they didn't want to be included in this. But I thought it was unfair that a few guys were going to get sacrificed for the sake of, just somebody's going to take the fall for this.
Durkin had seen and heard too much to back down.
I know there was one particular instance where one of the agents reported seeing Leo Melamed and Sam Cali do this trade on the curb. My argument was, well, give me a break. Sam Cali's doing this with the president of the exchange, and he's supposed to think he's committing a federal crime? Are you crazy? How does that work?
With that kind of evidence to back up his defense, it's easy to understand why Durkin thought he was doing the right thing. The defense attorneys in the main trial and Melamed's attorney, they were not happy with Durkin. But he did have an unlikely ally in Dietrich Volk.
When he argued and stated in opening arguments that his client, who was an ABS broker, was forced to change a price on an order he had executed for Leo Melamed's account, which Leo Melamed would have known that changing that price meant getting a local bagman to agree to take the loss, knowing that that broker in turn would steal money from other customers to repay that bagman. And I think Leo Melamed knew the full scope of those activities when he demanded the price change.
As the severed trial approached, tensions rose. On one hand, Ray and Sam's attorneys had gathered an incredible amount of evidence to support the claim that their clients were part of a culture at the Merc where violating trading regulations was standard operating procedure, and that trading violations were not federal crimes because they did not intend to defraud. On the other hand, Ray and Sam faced very serious charges that could put them away for a long time. To make matters worse, the government was not happy that they came up empty in the main Yen trial, so they weren't about to let Sam Cali and Ray Pace off the hook. Something had to give.
The government came to us and made an offer that we really couldn't refuse in terms of risk. I know Sam went to prison, which happens all the time when the government puts something on the table that is so much better than what you could get if you lost. Because if you went down in RICO, it was a big deal. Sam was not a wealthy man. He didn't have an enormous amount of money to throw at this. These are tough calls to make. It's a very hard decision for somebody. From what I've always understood, he was happy to have it behind him.
Sam Cali's fellow defendant, Ray Pace, had the same decision to make. Take the deal or fight the government in court.
And this is why, you could look at the stats. I think the government's got a 95% conviction rate or something like that once you're indicted. That's one of the reasons. Guys are exhausted. They don't have the money anymore to fight it. You can't do it. They also threatened to take those guys back to trial, even though they had already, went to trial for 5 months. They said they were going to retry them.
So, because some of the 19 traders that went free after the main Yen trial were let off due to a hung jury, the government could retry them. And that's what they were threatening to do when Ray had to make his decision.
No, I wasn't afraid to go to trial, but I didn't have them. I couldn't pay my attorney. I didn't have anything. There's nothing for me to give him. I didn't want to sell my house, which I would have had to do to go back to trial to pay my attorney. So you go ahead and you take the plea agreement. And that's what I did. Well, the one count I pled guilty was $87.50. Okay, I don't know, it was a 7-lot, I don't know, it was $12.50 a tick, you could figure it out, I don't know what it was. And there was another one out of the 180 counts or whatever you could pick and plead to. Your guidelines are the same thing, which is how much time you're going to do depending on the dollar amount in your case. And mine was 8 to 14 months maybe or something like that. And I did 9 and I had to go away. It cost me 9 months out of my life, and 9 months in Minnesota, and then 3 months here in a halfway house in Chicago.
Shortly after starting his sentence, Ray found out that his wife was pregnant with their first child. He tried to get his sentence reduced to make it home before his wife gave birth.
I still, to this day, and it's so many years later, I remember because my daughter was 28 and she was born 7-8 days before I came home. So I wasn't there, but so I missed it by 8 days. I couldn't get enough time knocked off to get her back in time, so it was a tough time, My youngest one doesn't know all the details yet, And sometimes my wife will say, don't say nothing, one of the guys she's dating or whatever. I'm not ashamed of it. I'm not afraid to talk about her because I know I didn't do anything wrong, so it doesn't scare me. I'm not afraid of that, It's kind of a tough deal to do with your kid, that's for sure, to explain that to them, what happened. They think somebody went away, you're a bad guy. It's not it, I don't know if I had $1,000 to my name after I came home. I'm not exaggerating. I was there for 9 months. I paid my attorney, I didn't borrow a dime from no one, and used all the money that I had, which wasn't, that was it.
Broke and unable to trade again, Ray came home to a beautiful new baby girl and began rebuilding his life. He worked on movie sets, and eventually he returned to the floor as a clerk, and he made decent money. It must have been a bittersweet time for him, though. While he was back home, surrounded by friends and family, he had to start over as a convicted criminal. Meanwhile, so many around him continued to prosper, completely untainted by Operations Hedge Clipper and Sour Mash.
I'm thinking, man, you guys you have no idea. You think you had a bad day, you have no idea what you're talking about. You don't realize what just happened down here with us, with the guys that I'm doing time for this stuff. Are you kidding me? Really? I had to go away for 9 fucking months for this? Miss the birth of my kid? The first year, for what? Commodity fucking afraid? Is that what you're telling me? You know what I mean? So when I'm around these guys, it took me a while to try and, it's not their fault, it's just sometimes you come home and you're really, really bitter. You're bitter, and I don't want to dwell on that stuff, It's not good. Yeah, it's not good.
Ray had buried the past and moved on. Running his boxing gym, the one we're interviewing him in right now, clearly makes him happy. It's like he was always meant to end up here. But on this day, I could tell some of those old negative feelings were burning inside of him. I only hope that talking about it again gave him a sense of closure. For Sam Cali and Ray Pace, pleading guilty ended the ordeal of a trial, but it turned their lives upside down. For the exchange leaders, no trial meant the mountains of damning testimony in the Durkin document were never heard in court. The last 2 people I interviewed for this podcast, FBI agent Dietrich Volk and defense attorney Tom Durkin, really helped me understand why things went down the way they did. In theory, they were on opposite sides of this case, but you wouldn't know it from talking to them. Here's Dieter.
Everybody down there knew about the people that controlled that exchange were the people that could afford to buy the most seats. Each seat was a vote. So the guy with the biggest pile of money, who can buy the most seats, has the most control over the rules and the way things are done. The people that controlled the Merc came up and endorsed the system and indeed took advantage of it.
Dieter tried to go after the people in charge, both on the exchange level and within companies like ABS Partners. It was his job, but he also felt like he owed it to the traders who were cooperating.
A lot of it was care and feeding of the cooperators, which meant at least once a week, if not more. I would meet with them. It was important because, you ever go out and you make a large purchase, and then you're still checking the pricing for a week or two afterwards. I wanted to convince them that they got a good price. I think it was beneficial for their peace of mind to hear themselves and come to the reckoning, I was sunk. I had to do this.
Like Dieter, Tom Durkin also learned the unspoken ways of the floor.
It certainly became very clear to me that the Merc was run by a very small group of people. Jack Sandner among them. And I certainly didn't think Jack Sandner was a crook. The feds might have, I don't know.
There was only one thing they disagreed on.
I think the FBI saw it all as fraudulent, and I didn't see it that way at all. And I think ultimately we were vindicated on that. I mean, I think that's pretty much how the juries viewed it in some instances. But, again, people went to prison.
At the end of the day, it wasn't Durkin's job to go after the guys on top. His job was to defend Sam Cali, and he had some thoughts on why his client ended up in jail.
Well, I thought putting an undercover agent in the pit was too far. You have to understand what level of approval you have to get on a case in order to get an undercover agent into something like this. I mean, this has to be vetted all the way up at the Department of Justice. Undercover operations, by definition, are very dangerous to civil liberties, I think. So a lot of reputations get put on the line then, and that's kind of how some of these things happen, that once they make decisions to do that, then you better come up with something.
Think again about the cost and sheer scale of this investigation. The four undercovers lived the life of luxury for several years. They were given Rolex watches and fancy cars. They joined exclusive clubs and lived in expensive high-rise apartments. Then there were their six-figure seats on the exchange and the money that padded their trading accounts. Dozens of additional agents were needed to handle logistics, paperwork, and forensic accounting. It all added up to one huge and expensive endeavor.
There's a lot of promotions involved. There's a lot of job security involved here, and I think a bit of that may have occurred here.
The stakes were too high to come away empty-handed. So they did make cases. Almost 50 of them. Ray missed the birth of his daughter while he was in jail. T-Bun bartends at a dive bar in Chicago. And 30 years after the investigation, we found Melanie Kozar still working at her family's dry cleaning shop. Most of the people indicted never traded again, and those found guilty now had a criminal record that was hard to recover from. But what about the people that ran things?
It was always quoted as saying, this is not the cesspool that they say it is. That offended some people. That I would say, well, it's not really a cesspool. Maybe a little shaky. They may not play by their own rules. There was also no question in my mind there were the rules in the book, and then there were the real rules, and then there were the real people who ran things. And if you knew the people that ran things, that you got treated differently. But that's been the story in Chicago for if not everywhere else in the world for as long as I've been around.
As for the government, they certainly had noble intentions, but it felt to most, including Durkin, that they missed what they were truly trying to achieve.
Those things happen sometimes in big federal investigations. And like most investigations, the government is always hoping that somehow somebody will put them on to the big fish for bigger offenses, say. They didn't risk putting guys in the pit for this kind of nickel-dime shit. They had to have other reasons to think that this could come within the net.
And while no big fish were caught in the net, Agent Volk told me that they were closer than anyone realized.
Well, I can't really say that we never got close enough. We got one man away, and his name was Sam Cali. It was just a tough nut to crack. I think we did get close. I'm sure too close for Leo Melamed.
We started out this segment with the story of Sam Cali, who agreed to cooperate with the government and then changed his mind after a convincing phone call. Volk remained steadfast that if Sam Cali, Ray Pace, and other ABS brokers cooperated, it would have led to more and bigger indictments.
The only thing I can say was just we needed more of the same. Whether it's on the streets of New York or the pits of Chicago or the Colombo organized crime family, you don't start at the top. Unfortunately, you have to start at the bottom of their organization because they've spent years of building layers of insulation between themselves and the dirty work that goes on. It takes time. It takes years in most cases to get those kinds of breaks.
In the beginning, I thought this was a story about an epic standoff between hotshot traitors and the fish-out-of-water FBI agents who infiltrated them. In the end, I realized that the traitors and the agents, they're just foot soldiers. This was a war between the Justice Department and the power players of the Chicago trading world. This story is not well known, but it's a classic tale of greed and corruption in America. In many ways, it's reminiscent of a story that took place about 20 years later, the global financial crisis of 2008. I only realized this after I read the sweeping allegations against the top brass of the Merc in the Durkin document.
The whole time, we're like, how come nobody's going after the big guys? How come nobody's going after the big guys? And then at the end, we're like, look, one person tried to go after the big guys, and it fucking got killed. And this is what is wrong with our society today, is that nobody fucking stands up and nobody cares, and everyone, it's a version
everybody
of like.
passes a buck.
Exactly. I'm like Volk is the one guy who fucking cared, Leo Melamed and the heads of the exchange, they're the bankers in 08. They're the bankers that never went to jail, that's literally the same thing. This whole system was just ripe for abuse, and people stole. Obviously, we've established now that everybody stole. It was so fucking common, and everyone did it. And Ray Pace goes to jail, and Leo Melamed is a hero. And it's literally 2008. How long are we going to keep fucking letting this happen?
Like in 2008, pure greed mixed with financial engineering run amok created a system that few understood and allowed those who created it to profit beyond their wildest dreams. Like in 08, the men in charge were never punished. We all know about the crisis of 08 because it affected everyone. In this case, the faceless victims were less sympathetic. But my point in all this is, corruption is corruption, and someone is always responsible for it. The average CEO in America makes hundreds and sometimes thousands of times the median workers' pay at their companies. They enjoy all the success and wealth that they've earned when things are going well. So when they're not, let's hold them accountable rather than letting them blame a few bad apples. Thank you for listening to Brokers, Bagmen, and Moles. If you're still listening at this point in our show, I have two things to say to you. One, thank you. We are truly grateful. And two, it's obvious there's more to the story, right? So, right before we finished this podcast, we received a CD-ROM, remember those, from the government, which contained the FBI case files that we requested 2 years before. The files confirmed something that we always thought, but were never able to prove: that this investigation was about more than trading violations. The stated objectives of the case read as follows. Quote, Objective 1. Gather evidence against Chicago Mercantile Exchange brokers engaged in illegal, non-competitive trading. Objective 2. Gather evidence against Chicago Mercantile Exchange brokers engaged in violations of income tax, narcotics, and gambling laws. Until now, the closest we ever got was talking to Agent Volk.
There were individuals trading in the S&P pit that were of interest to the Bureau because of their organized crime affiliations. In many ways, we thought, well, maybe they're there doing something beyond just trading and taking advantage of the abuses. Maybe they're moving money. We never got close enough to find out for sure. We were trying to.
Volk admitted that they were looking for money laundering and mafia activity, but he said they couldn't come up with much. As I think back on our interviews, there was something that T-Bun said way back that all of a sudden has a lot more meaning.
They were looking, but they never found anything.
And what we recently discovered is that the reason they never found anything, it's not because it wasn't going on. They just didn't know where to look.
This guy was, had mob ties, was doing all kinds of questionable stuff down there, had all these, shady relationships, but somehow it was barely mentioned in the book, never mentioned in the articles at the time.
It's hard to get to those guys.
Yeah.
It's hard to get close enough to them with a wire to get him to say anything.
If they had gotten in with the right people and might have been able to hear some of these stories of who was actually pushing money up to the outfit.
He was shaking traders down for money. Every Christmas he'd come around and you'd have to step out of the pit and hand him a big wad of money,
It's when they knew that when he sort of extorted money from people, it got spread out to the wise guys. So that was just kind of common knowledge.
So that's the guy, that's his mob boss on the street, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
That would be the guy he would, his family he would kick up to. Trading floor was just a good moneymaker for that family.
Before you go, if you or someone you know might have a hot tip or just a funny story related to our show, we have a hotline for you. Call us at 646-820-1452. That's 646-820-1452. And please follow us on social media. Our handle is @EntropyMediaCo. That's @EntropyMediaCo, where we'll be posting additional information about the case and awesome behind-the-scenes action. This has been a production of Entropy Media in association with Stretch Productions. This is Entropy's very first show, so if you've enjoyed it, please follow wherever you listen to podcasts and rate us there too. Every follow, rating, or even a personal recommendation to a friend or family member really helps. I'm your host, Anjay Nagpal. Our showrunner and senior producer is Danielle Elliot. Our producer is Jen Swan. Our executive producers are Tim Hendricks, Kevin Stretch Huff, and Dennis Stratton. Original music, sound design, and editing by Gerard Bauer. Music clearances by Deborah Manis Gardner from DMG Clearances. Production legal by Bruns, Brennan, and Barry. Legal clearance fair use by Rachel Strom at Davis Wright Tremaine. Fact-checking by Delilah Friedler. Show art by Rebecca Hendon. And from Entropy Media, our in-house executive producer is Josh Fielstad. Our head of operations is Nuna Ebo. Our project manager is Sebastian Perry. Our associate producer is Heidi Rudvolts. Our development coordinator is Simona Kessler. And I want to send a very special thanks to Lori Morse and David Greason.